Well, hello and welcome to Worldview and Interdisciplinarity. And in this module, we're focusing on providing a primer, um, a very quick overview of worldview, a few comparative approaches, uh, and then landing on a biblical worldview, and, and the concept of interdisciplinarity. And so we'll look at both of these ideas and their interdependence, if you will, as we introduce the study. So um, that's where we're headed. So first of all, and I'm going to assume that you haven't seen this before, that this is kind of new for you. I don't want to assume anything as far as you're having dealt with this before. So this is going to possibly be some review for you, but try to provide you some basic worldview concepts. Okay, so here is this chart. You've seen it. If you've had classes with me, you've surely seen it before. If you haven't, welcome to the jungle. Here we go. All right, so components of worldview. All worldviews will necessarily have the same kinds of questions to answer. Okay, and this chart is designed to represent um, the skeleton that would work with any worldview at all, okay, no matter what the system. So just to kind of walk through this chart a little bit, on the right side we've got the red arrow, which is directing us to begin at the bottom and work our way to the top, okay? On the left side we have is and ought. And you'll notice that the first two boxes, epistemology and metaphysics, are in the is category. They are descriptive. They're trying to describe the world around us and how it works. Then there's the ought category, which is representative of ethics and sociopolitical thought. Once we understand the is, the descriptive, then we move to the ought, what we should do about it. So we have these two concepts, descriptive and prescriptive, and they're very much separate, but very, again, one is certainly dependent on the other. You've got to have a good is in order to have a good ought, if that makes sense. Okay, then we've got our four blue boxes that give us the major components of worldview or fields of study for worldview. First is epistemology. Second is metaphysics. Third is ethics. Fourth is sociopolitical. Now, one note here, you see that green arrow showing that epistemology and metaphysics are interchangeable. And the idea here is that in reality, what actually is reality comes before our perception of it. And because epistemology deals with our perception of reality, in doing worldview, epistemology would come first in that process, but the reality is before the perception of the reality, so technically metaphysics would come first, right? So if we're talking about actuality, metaphysics would precede epistemology, but because we're doing worldview, that requires us to view the world, that requires us to perceive it, so we have to do epistemology first. Okay, that's what the green arrow indicates. If that didn't make any sense, don't pay any attention to it. It's not super necessary. But it's there. Okay, so you'll see this chart throughout this module, this class, and these programs as it's kind of helping us to visualize this unification of disciplines, of studies under a meta-narrative or a grand truth, if you will. And in our perspective, of course, we're working from a biblical framework, desiring to show that and desiring to help you think through how the biblical model truly unifies disciplines, the fields of study, etc. So you'll become, I would suggest, probably pretty familiar with this chart. Okay, before this module is done, anyway. Okay. Now, a few of these books are assigned, but I want to just throw these out to you. I've tried to be pretty diligent in writing, dealing with worldview issues, unifying of disciplines under the biblical model. So these might be helpful. Some of them are assigned, so whether you find them helpful or not, of course I hope and pray you do, but Prolegomena on Biblical Hermeneutics and Method is trying to carry a person from the basics of worldview up through processes of doing exegesis and theology and understanding how those work. Priority in Biblical Hermeneutics, Theological Method, is a little more advanced discussion of hermeneutic issues and methodological issues related to biblical study and the impact on other disciplines. Redacted Dominionism is a book focusing on how one can draw an ethic from the pages of Scripture. Specifically, we're looking at Genesis and looking at an environmental ethic embedded there in the text. Life Beyond the Sun, Worldview and Philosophy Through the Lens of Ecclesiastes, is kind of a part introduction to philosophy and worldview and part commentary on Ecclesiastes, because in fact Ecclesiastes is very much a worldview and philosophy text in a lot of ways. And so that also provides some primary source readings. It's a little bit of a primer, a reader in basic philosophy. Applied Biblical Worldview, Essays on Christian Ethics, is looking at applying the biblical worldview, the epistemological, metaphysical concepts in ethics and into sociopolitical. And then Authentic Social Justice is the most recent of these books, and it is focused on contemporary issues related to social interaction and some of the key issues, gender identity issues, sexuality issues, racial issues, those kinds of things that are kind of top of the conversation today. So again, some of these are assigned to you, but I want to introduce you to these. I also try to be fairly diligent writing articles that would be helpful, providing those at obviously no charge on drcone.com. So avail yourself of those resources if you'd like. They're available there for you. But let's go ahead and jump in now to our elements of worldview. So we're dealing with two things here. First of all, we want to focus on the concept of worldview. So we're gonna be dealing with that pretty extensively. We're going to walk through the foundational elements, those components, those four components. We'll walk through those components and then give some competing views, concluding with a biblical model. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity and how these disciplines work together so that you have a good foundation moving forward for the concepts of worldview and interdisciplinarity. Okay, so we start with epistemology, the first of these four components of worldview. Epistemology on the chart has two major issues. Again, starting at the bottom and working our way up. First is the source of authority. Okay, every worldview has a presumed source of authority. How do we answer these questions? We have to go to a source or a variety of sources in order to provide answers for these questions. And then we have to interpret that authority, that source. We have to interpret that source correctly, because if we go to the right source but we misunderstand, we misinterpret, we may as well have gone to the wrong source in a sense. Okay, so those are two things that every worldview in its epistemology will have: identifying the source of authority and then interpreting that particular authority. Okay, epistemology is the study of knowledge, and it asks really four major questions. Okay, first of all, how can we know? How can we have knowledge? Okay, this is the basic question that's undertaken. Episteme is the Greek word for knowledge, and of course logos is a word, so epistemology, study of knowledge. How can we know? In order to engage in worldview, in order to engage in any discipline, any course of study, we have to be able to answer that question. How can I know? How do I gain truth? Where does knowledge come from? So any worldview has got to answer that core question. They've got to identify where knowledge comes from. Okay. Secondly, the worldview in its epistemology has got to deal with the question of how we can be certain. Certainty is a necessity, and we can have knowledge, but is it something that we're confident in? Is it certain knowledge? Is it true? Okay. Truth is a big deal here. How can we be certain? Third, who will we trust? Who will we trust? That source of authority, that basis of knowledge, if it's not trustworthy, then it isn't providing us truth. It's providing us really deception. Okay? So we have to choose correctly. Now, you'll notice I've got the image of a roundabout there, a sign, right? That shows a circle. And something for you to think about, in any system, we can violate logic, right? We can engage in a logical fallacy of circular reasoning or begging the question. If something is self-justifying, it's begging the question. Okay? And once in a system, it's not allowed in logic. It's not valid circular reasoning. But what we discover as we embark on this process is that in every worldview, in the first step, trying to determine who is that or what is that source of authority, to whom or what will we go in order to rely, here's what we have to consider. Every worldview, every system requires a first step of faith, a leap of faith, if you will. Maybe you would even call it circular reasoning at the start. If I'm trusting a source of authority and I'm determining from that source of authority how I can know anything, then that source of authority in my system is self-authenticating. I'm trusting it and then seeing what will happen and what will be discovered as I trust that source of authority. I may later find that source of authority is incorrect, right? That it's not worthy of trust. But what we discover is every worldview has to deal with this question, and every worldview requires that you take that first leap of faith. Here's a key implication of that reality. There is no specific system that is a faith system versus other systems. Any worldview, any system of understanding is built on faith. And we have to have faith in order to engage in the system. Okay? That first step of belief. So the critic of one worldview might say to the adherent of another worldview, or of that worldview that the critic is criticizing, you're a person of faith. You are not reasonable, but you're trusting in trust. Well, the reality is all of us are trusting in something, and the question is whether or not that trust is warranted. Okay, so who will we trust? That may be the most important of these questions, because if we answer that correctly, then we have the answer for the question of how we can know and how we can be certain. Okay. But once we answer the question of whom we will trust, we have to answer the question of how we will interpret. How do we interpret that source of authority? And each source of authority is going to require some different kinds of interpretation, right? So we have to kind of look at it on a case-by-case basis. But that's what epistemology is addressing. Okay? How can we know? How can we be certain? Who will we trust? How do we interpret whoever it is that we're going to trust? Epistemology. Okay? Metaphysics, as the second discipline that we're going to look at, metaphysics really deals with four major questions. There are obviously many questions that stem off of that. But what exists is our first question. Metaphysics will deal with what exists, what is reality, overall? What reality consists of, whether it goes beyond the natural and the physical, metaphysics, or whether it is encapsulated in the physical. But these are the questions and issues that metaphysics is dealing with. First, what exists? Okay, well, that's the study of ontology within metaphysics. What exists? Then we've got what is good. What is good? That's another key question. And play around with this for a minute. The question of value, axiology, is critical. I mean, when you ask the question, what is good, you may come up with a quick answer, but it's maybe not so simple. Aristotle, for example, will talk about what is good, describing usefulness and things that are good for a particular usefulness. And then he describes an ultimate good, a good that's good on its own and for its own purpose. And he will argue, for example, that happiness is the only absolute good that is good on its own, for no other higher purpose. Well, if you subscribe to Aristotle's version of good, that's going to impact how you see metaphysics, ethics, sociopolitical thought, ultimately, right? So how we answer these questions is super important. What is good? The question of value. Axiology will study value and address not only the question of what is good, but also the specifics and why what is good is good. Okay? Third would be teleology. And teleology is really dealing with design or purpose. It's dealing with the telos, the end, the conclusion, the design, the purpose of the whole thing, right? What's the purpose? What's the meaning of all of this? And in order to have a design and a purpose, you would think you need to have something or someone that has purposed this or designed this. And we might find, for example, that we discover nothing in our experience that isn't without design or without purpose. And those things that we might not understand the purpose for, we would certainly still be searching for what that purpose is. But in our experience, everything that we can identify its purpose has a purpose or a designer. That's another conversation, but that's within the study of teleology. And then finally, we would look at eschatology, or the study of last things or things to come. And eschatology simply asks the question, what will happen? Every worldview has to address the question of what's next, what's going to happen, where's all this going, right? And you'll notice that these are all very interrelated questions, right? What exists? Well, if I determine that only the natural exists, well, that would rule God out if God is beyond nature, right? If I suggest that nature is all that there is, or that the natural physical world is all that there is, then that would preclude the existence of the human soul, right? And so some of these questions would be answered by my presumption, by my presuppositions. Now, presuppositions really fit back in the epistemology model, because if I suggest that only that which exists is that which is physical or in the natural realm, well, then I might conclude that I might conclude in my epistemology that the source of authority is my senses or my experience, right? So metaphysics and epistemology are really interdependent. Okay? To answer these questions, I have to have an epistemology resolved. I have to know what's the source of authority that I can trust to answer these questions about what is reality around me, right? What exists? Well, if I'm limited by my ability to sense, that's very limiting. I can only sense that which is in my immediate periphery, right? So I'm very limited. If I suggest that all that exists is that which I can process and reason through, again, I'm limited by what I can interact with. And so, again, these are vital questions that are interrelated and that rely on a foundation, an epistemological foundation. And so, as I ask the question of what exists, as I ask the question, what is good? Who determines what is good? What's good to me might be different than what is good for you and to you. And so you may consider what is good to me to be bad, in fact. How do we justify that? How do we deal with these contradictions? And then what's the purpose? What's the meaning of all of this? What's the point, right? Because if I determine that there is no purpose, there is no meaning, then what's the value of answering the questions? What's the value of even asking the questions, right? So these are vital questions. These are core questions everybody has to answer. And by the way, everybody would already be practically walking as if they have the answer to these questions, right? People are engaging in behavior that demonstrates a belief in a particular answer. What exists? If someone determines that God exists and their behavior shows that, that would be, we consider that consistent. What if someone is walking like there is no God, but they're saying that God exists? Well, that'd be pretty inconsistent, and we might suggest that their worldview is not cogent, that they need some thought given to their worldview, right? If they're living like the purpose is to satisfy their own pleasures, and yet they argue that there is no soul or no eternity or no purpose, no divine purpose, let's say, then you could challenge them about consistency, because they are practically living as if the purpose was pleasure. So let's reevaluate the worldview through a hedonistic perspective, right? Or if someone is pursuing their pleasures, but arguing that there's a God, a divine entity who has given direction, well, they'd be inconsistent with that unless that divine direction is the seeking of pleasure, right? And on the what will happen front, eschatology, this element of metaphysics is telling us where it's all going, which helps us understand what is good, right? The destination, it makes a difference. If we're going to be taking a vacation to the Caribbean, for example, and spend some time on the beach, which sounds just marvelous, then we would probably want to pack a swimming suit or multiple swimming suits, right? Maybe some skin treatments like sunblock or suntan lotion, or oils or aloe for sunburns, right? These kinds of things. Or perhaps we would want clothing that's for warm climates, right? The destination determines how we engage. And so we can't even get into the ought until we answer these questions of where this is all going. What's the destination? Okay, pretty straightforward stuff there. Ethics. Once we move from epistemology and the basic questions of how we know what we know to metaphysics, and then we move from epistemology to metaphysics, answering these four major questions: what exists, what is good, what's the purpose, and where's it all going? We have a good, if we're correct, we have a good description of how things are. Okay, we have the is. And David Hume kind of talked about the conflict between is and ought, so I'm kind of borrowing his term here, using it a little differently in a sense, because he might argue that we can't get a full picture of the is outside of our sensory perception. Obviously, I'm not going to agree with that, but I still see value in recognizing the distinction between descriptive, how things are, and prescriptive, how things ought to be or what we ought to do about them, how we ought to move forward. So, for example, science can tell us how to clone, okay? How to clone animals, for example. So science can do that, but science can't tell us whether we should or not. Science can't get us into the ought. It can give us some insight in the is insofar as its scope allows, but it can't get us to the ought, tell us what ought to happen. It's not necessarily predictive to the point of telling us an eschatology, although some might argue with that. But the idea is that we move from descriptive to prescriptive, and that move is necessary. We have to have some insight into ethics and then sociopolitical thought. Ethics is the individual morality, and sociopolitical thought is really more morality in a community setting, right? Okay, so ethics is really asking a couple of key questions. What should an unbeliever do, and then what should a believer do? Okay, now that might sound strange, especially if one holds to an atheistic worldview. In the ethics of atheism, for example, might we have different ethical responsibilities? Why are we talking about unbelievers and believers? Well, here's the reality. Every worldview has believers and unbelievers. And every worldview, the first step in the ought is that an unbeliever should become a believer in the worldview, whatever that worldview is. It's going to be prescribing that each person would go back to the epistemological process and identify the source of authority in agreement with that particular worldview. So the atheist worldview would call upon Christians to change their source of authority so that they become a believer in the atheistic worldview. The Christian adherent would challenge the atheist to revisit epistemology, changing the source of authority from one's own self, for example, or experience, or the use of reason in particular capacities to the biblical God, and to change the metaphysic that results, the understanding of what is reality, of what exists, of what is good, of what the design is, of where it's all going, so that when you get to ethics, that person is now a believer in that worldview. Okay, so the idea here is that every worldview has an epistemology, has a metaphysics, but also has an ethics. And the first ethic is that unbelievers should become believers. Now, once an unbeliever has become a believer, then that's a whole other set of ethics. Well, now what do I do? As a believer in this particular worldview, what are my responsibilities? Well, that depends on the metaphysics, right? For example, in the Christian system, when you look at metaphysics, ontology, axiology, teleology, eschatology, you'll find the topics of what we call systematic theology, okay? The study of God, theology, systematized or categorized or ordered. So, for example, in theology, we have, in Christian theology, bibliology, the study of divine revelation, the study of the Bible. Well, that would go back to epistemology, right? Source of authority, how we interpret that authority, even hermeneutics, how we understand. In metaphysics, ontology, what exists? Well, we'd get into theology, saying that God exists. We would get into Christology, that Jesus Christ exists. Pneumatology, that God's Spirit exists. We get into angelology, that angels and demons exist. Demonology, right? Anthropology, that humanity exists, right? All these things are part of reality, and that source of authority, the biblical record, defines them. But then axiology, what is good? Well, in this, we would deal with some theology proper, where we're understanding the character of God and what God prescribes, getting into ethics a little bit. But we see the reverse of that in hamartiology. What is the problem? So we can understand what is good by understanding what is problematic here, right? And we understand them both together. Hamartiology focuses on the negative side of it, though, of course. But that's within axiology. Teleology, the purpose or the design, right? Well, that would fit within the study of theology proper, Christology, pneumatology, understanding who God is, what his purposes are. And eschatology, well, there's an element of theology called eschatology, the same term, right, that would fit here. Just what's going to happen? What's the future hold? So that study's important as well. So you'll find that within, especially metaphysics, a little bit in epistemology, a little bit in ethics, right? But you find theology within all these elements. So I use the Christian system as an example to say, in ethics, when we're trying to understand what should believers do, we have this entire body of knowledge that we're working from, elements of epistemology, theological elements in metaphysics, and even some aspects of ethics. So each worldview has two main ethical concepts. One, become a believer, and then two, as a believer, here are your responsibilities. Okay? No matter what the worldview, they will all share those two concepts within ethics. Okay? Then moving to sociopolitical, it's ethics to the community degree. It's really dealing with, instead of individual, what should I do and what should you do, it's what should we do. There's a meta and micro element. What should we do? And it really kind of start with the micro, the smaller elements of community. Maybe you'd have the couple, the family unit, and then into the neighborhood and the village and the city, right, and the state and the nation, right, and you have these various communities that provide, if you will, different delineations of socio-political engagement. Okay? And again, in the biblical model, the Christian approach, we'll see there's also this thing called the church. And this church or assembly, the ecclesia, that Jesus said he would start, and which we see begins in Acts chapter 2, this ecclesia, this assembly, has its own socio-political rules that those who are unbelievers and not part of this ecclesia, they're not necessarily bound by those. They don't have that same responsibility. So we see, again, different ethical responsibilities for believers and unbelievers, and then that plays out also in the socio-political realm as well. Now, in another sense, there's the meta element where we're all part of the world community, we're all part of the human race, and so there are certain responsibilities that we have there. For example, in the biblical model, in Genesis chapter 9, because all humanity is created in the image of God, human life is sacred and is not to be taken. God spells that out in Genesis 9. So this is something that all humanity is accountable for. And by the way, not only all humanity, but also the animals are held accountable by God for how they engage with the sanctity of human life. So there's a socio-political element that encompasses everyone. You can think about it like an upside-down pyramid, right? Ethics is the tip of that pyramid. That's what should I do or what should you do, the individual. And then as community expands, we recognize there are different socio-political responsibilities, right, with each delineation and each expansion, okay, socio-political. So there is a very brief overview of the four components of worldview that every worldview has to deal with, the questions that every worldview has to answer, and ultimately it's not just the responsibility of a worldview, but each person has to address these questions. Each person has to deal with the realities of who they'll trust, how they can have certainty, what exists. Does the human soul exist? Does eternity exist? Or is it all temporal? What should they do? What are their responsibilities? What's the meaning of all this? These questions are universal, okay? And everyone has to address them. Consequently, pardon me, every worldview has to address them. Okay? Now, some worldviews are attempting to be consistent, while others make no such effort. Some worldviews won't try to address every question, but they ought to, and those gaps become really apparent. And let's say a worldview has these four components, and let's just say, again, picking a number out of a hat, let's say there's 20 questions that every worldview has to answer, okay? 20 questions. But let's say a given worldview only addresses 12 of those questions. It doesn't address the other 8. One of our goals is to be able to study that worldview, understand that they're only addressing the 12 questions, and the other 8 questions are assumed. In other words, even without addressing those 8, you can arrive at answers to those 8 by looking at the other 12. So the process of doing worldview can be a little bit predictive, and you can identify cogency and even some inconsistency by going through these steps in this process. So there we are, basics of worldview. Okay, now let's look at things a little bit more closely, and look at some comparisons. Okay, so we'll focus on epistemology here because that really sets the tone for everything. So we'll look at a few different theorists and think about some comparative views. Okay, so first of all, again, we've addressed this in summary. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and addresses the major question of how we can know. It is absolutely a necessary first step. Before we can answer other questions, we've got to be able to answer that question of the nature of evidence, and who we will trust and why, okay, on what basis. And of course, it's the bedrock of worldview, the foundational discipline, supporting metaphysics, ethics, and sociopolitical thought. Okay, so let's work with a few major systems. Okay, we'll look at Descartes' rationalism, look at Hume's empiricism. We'll look at Nietzsche's existentialism, and we'll look at a biblical model. Okay, so these are the 4 major models that the other systems out there will kind of glom onto one or the other foundational concept. So we start with Descartes. Descartes says it's the part of prudence not to place absolute confidence in that by which we have even once been deceived. Okay, so he's going to try to figure out on what shall we base our worldview, and he says anything that would deceive us even once is not reliable. I'm not going to trust that. But he says one thing I can trust is that I exist as necessarily true each time it's expressed by me or conceived in my mind. So he can trust that fact that he exists. And based on that existence, we get that famous Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, loosely, I think, therefore I am. And for Descartes, reason is the ultimate arbiter of truth, which essentially makes the individual the arbiter of truth. Now, Descartes certainly was a theist, but in practicality, he designed a system where God has given us this system of reason, and we can reason our way to all the truths we need, so we don't really need God, for any real practical purposes. David Hume, on the other hand, would argue strongly with Descartes' concept. He says, all ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. Mind has but a slender hold on them. They're apt to be confounded with other resembling ideas. Okay, so you have all these ideas, But he talks about impressions, all sensations, either outward or inward, are strong and vivid, and the limits between them are more exactly determined, nor is it easy to fall into any error or mistake with regard to them. Okay, here's what he's doing. Hume is suggesting that you have ideas and impressions are the strongest of the ideas because they're the sensations and you're getting them right then, engaging with that idea, so they're more vivid. The remembrance or the recollection, and the RE on the beginning of each of those words, right? Those things are not as valuable as the initial sensation or impression. And Hume is going to suggest that reason is dependent on those secondary processes, the remembering, the recollection, the reprocessing. But on the other hand, the experience is dependent on the senses and on the impressions and sensations. And it's more valuable and more reliable. He says it's not easy to fall into error or mistake with regard to them. Okay, he says that concept of the impressions and the sensations actually being of more value, that it might render every dispute equally intelligible and banish all that jargon which has so long taken possession of metaphysical reasonings and drawn disgrace upon them. In other words, if you develop your metaphysics simply from your sensations and your impressions, then you're going to be much more accurate and you get rid of all the controversy. It's the reasonings and the remembrances and recollections and reprocessings that create the problem. Okay? And hence the metaphysical reasonings come under disgrace because of all these secondary processes. He's saying go with the impressions, go with that which is certain. Interesting application of that for Hume. Because of this, he is looking at only that which you can experience, that you can sense, and because of that, one implication is miracles certainly don't exist. He says, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous. So he's making a likelihood argument here, okay? And the idea is, as he puts it, is he sees a dead man, if someone tells him that he saw a dead man restored to life, he considers whether it's more likely that the person would lie or that the facts would be as reported. Well, in his experience, in his sensation, the impressions he gets is that people lie fairly often, but he's never seen anyone rise from the dead. Consequently, his empiricist epistemology requires Hume to say, therefore, there's no resurrection from the dead. So Hume is focused on what can be experienced and sensed, not so much on reason, where Descartes was focused much more on reason. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche goes a whole different direction. Whereas Descartes is saying you can know through the guided use of your reason and the capacities that are given to you. You can reason your way through an epistemology and a metaphysic, and therefore ethics and socio-political thought. Hume is saying you can't reason your way to these, but you can sense and experience your way to an understanding. You can know in both of these systems. But Nietzsche argues that we can know the phenomena or the experience, what we experience around us, but we can't know the noumena or reality itself. Okay? So phenomena is what we engage with, but the reality, ultimate reality has really no bearing. It's irrelevant to us because we can't know it, we can't engage it. Doesn't matter. Well, what's the meaning of life? Doesn't matter. What's real? Doesn't matter. Okay, because you can't engage with it, according to Nietzsche. So, implications. There may be some great reality out there involving the divine, but you can't know it. All you can know is what's around you. So he's Humean in that sense, but not as certain. He says, I entreat you, my brothers, remain true to the earth. Don't believe those who speak to you of super-terrestrial hopes. Okay? Beyond this earth. Anyone who's speaking to you about anything beyond this earth, he says they are poisoners, whether they know it or not. They're despisers of life, atrophying and self-poisoned men, of whom the earth is weary, so let them be gone. So Nietzsche has great distaste for anyone who will claim certainty beyond this natural realm. So Descartes is out and rationalism is out. Humean empiricism is actually okay because Hume argues there is nothing beyond what can be sensed and engaged. Nietzsche agrees with that, but ultimately he is focused more on one's own existence, hence the term existentialism, right? He's focused on that and not so much trying to come up with a meta-narrative or a great story or grand truth beyond that. He says, that is your entire will, you wisest man. It's a will to power, and that is so even when you talk of good and evil and the assessment of values. So Nietzsche has an epistemological premise describing his source of authority essentially as himself and his own senses, his own existence, which leads to a metaphysic. Notice here that when we talk of good and evil and the assessment of values, it's about our understanding. And then when you get to ethics, the responsibility is his will to power, which when you read Nietzsche, you discover, and you will with Thus Spake Zarathustra, you discover he's really focused on kind of overcoming self in order to be the greatest version of yourself. The problem is, to have greatest, you have to have great. To have great, you have to have better. And to have better, you have to have good. Good, better, great, greatest, right? Good, better, best. Well, what is good? So you have to answer that question before you can really understand where Nietzsche is going with all this. And Nietzsche, because of his epistemological framework, essentially says there is no actual good and evil. He writes beyond good and evil, in fact. There is only good and bad, and he means that in an instrumental sense, that which is good for you or bad for you, right? So Nietzsche brings another category. By the way, Nietzsche's existentialism is more similar to postmodernism, or I should say postmodernism is more similar to Nietzschean thought. And so this era that we're in, whether it's postmodern or post-postmodern, either way, I mean, we can get into splitting hairs there, but we're in a very existentialist time where if there's any absolute meaning, we can't know it. It's really about what we can know. We're going to focus on that. And in practicality, we make that the true meaning. So Nietzsche has had many ancestors of thought, descendants of thought. And it has implications in his ethics. This concept of will to power has implications, great implications in his socio-political thought and how he mandates that communities should engage. Okay, so here are the three major historical concepts: that reason is the source of authority, experience is the source of authority, or the individual is the source of authority. If one says guided use of reason, like Descartes is our authority, well, they're still really relying on self. I interpret, I'm the one that guides my reason. If I'm relying on my senses, then ultimately, again, in Hume's system, I'm still the source of authority. It's still focused on me. And for Nietzsche, clearly, Nietzsche would suggest we are the source of authority. Interestingly, though, these guys will prescribe. They'll make prescriptions, making them the source of authority, which is, again, an interesting thing to me. Kind of like the communists suggesting that we've got to get rid of all differences and take the wealth out of everybody's hands so that we can distribute it equally. Well, who's the one distributing it? Oh, the party, of course, the communists, right? Well, the problem with that is human nature. That's a whole other conversation, but it certainly bleeds over into the socio-political. Uh, so the idea here is that ideas have consequences. Okay, epistemological bases lead to metaphysical understandings of reality, and those understandings of reality lead to ethical mandates and responsibilities. Those ethical mandates and responsibilities lead to socio-political idea and governance. Okay, has sweeping practical impact. So really, for all of these, we're the ultimate arbiters of truth. We are the sources of authority individually. Okay, it's kind of everyone did what was right in the sight, in their own eyes, in their own sight. That kind of concept. We're the ultimate arbiters of truth. Now, in stark contrast to us being the arbiters of truth, we find a biblical model which has a different, totally different cosmology here, different design altogether. Okay, the source of authority, and we'll get into some pillars of kind of logic here in a little bit. But the basic source of authority in a biblical model is the Bible. Well, the Bible prescribes, or excuse me, the Bible describes that God is the ultimate source of authority, and that He's revealed Himself in this written Word. Okay, so in a biblical model, we're suggesting that the biblical God is the ultimate source of authority, and we see that mentioned a few times, right? Proverbs 1:7, written by Solomon, suggested to be in the biblical model the wisest person to ever have lived because he was blessed with divine wisdom by God directly. He says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay? Philosophy is the affection of wisdom. So the pursuit of true philosophy, according to Solomon, should begin with the fear of the Lord, the proper perspective of God in response to Him. Okay, well, that's a big statement. Wisdom for Descartes comes from using your ability to reason. Wisdom from Hume comes from your ability to sense and experience. Wisdom from Nietzsche, from his perspective, is similar to Hume, but ultimately it's more self-oriented. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in the biblical model. Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So wisdom is coming from the fear of the Lord, and the knowledge of the Holy One, the knowledge of God Himself, is true understanding. We read that the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom. Okay, so the proverbist here in his Solomonic wisdom is making it very clear that you can't begin this process of having truth and certainty unless you begin with God. Okay, that's the clear model. The reverse of that is in Psalm 14:1, where the psalmist records that the fool has said in his heart that there's no God. This is an inner declaration that there is no God. I'm not going to begin with God. I'm going to begin without God and see where that takes me. But in the biblical model, that doesn't work. Where then do we get this wisdom and this real knowledge of God? Solomon tells us, Proverbs 2:6, the Lord gives wisdom, from His mouth comes wisdom and understanding. Well, remember, in these other passages, we saw the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So those two things we need to have, but God gives these things from His mouth. The statement is that the source of authority here, extrapolated from these passages, from Solomon and David, the source of authority is God is revealed in His Word, in the Bible. Okay, that's the statement that's being made here. That provides us the first part of of this epistemological concept. Okay, so we talk about pillars. We'll have 4 pillars here. It's just kind of a way to illustrate the logic of thinking through this. Okay, so let's just throw a few things up here. All right, pillar number 1: the biblical God exists. Okay, remember, every one of these worldviews begins with an epistemological premise, okay, or a leap of faith. Everyone begins with a circle. They have that first step of faith. Descartes trusts in his ability to reason. Hume trusts in his ability to experience. Nietzsche trusts also in his experience and his ability to reason through that. Self-reliance, that's the first step in these worldviews. In the biblical model, the first pillar, the first step is that the biblical God exists. This God claims exclusivity. This God claims holiness. Okay, so we learn that this one is claiming he's it, and he's holy, which means he is totally set apart or above that which he has created. So, and we see it in Isaiah 6, Revelation 4, these statements that the creatures around God are making constantly, and he chooses to be surrounded by these creatures. And so they're declaring that he is holy, holy, holy. In this epistemological model, God, not faith, but God is the final arbiter of truth. You see, in Descartes' rationalism, guided use of reason is the source of authority, but ultimately it's really my faith in that that is the ultimate source of authority. It's my faith in my ability to experience or to sense. My faith. But in this model, God is the arbiter of truth. He's revealed himself. It isn't fideism or the idea that faith itself is the arbiter of truth. Faith itself has no value. Faith is simply a belief in something, and the question is whether or not that something is warranted, right? So we start with that principle that the biblical God exists, and consider that the biblical model calls us to taste and see. Okay, it's not like try on Jesus. It's taste and see that the Lord is good. Psalm 34:8. And so my encouragement, whether or not you agree with a biblical worldview, my encouragement to you would be to work through the biblical worldview as it's laid out in Scripture, and just taste it and see that God indeed is good. And when you compare this with the other systems, some of which we've talked about and introduced, goodness is hard to find. I'll just put it that way. So Psalm 34:8 becomes a very important passage in thinking about worldview. Taste and see that the Lord is good. It invites interlocutors to examine, to think through, to consider, to taste, and to see. Okay, then we've got pillar number 2. If the biblical God exists, well, there's another key premise, and that is that the biblical God has revealed himself. And it sounds pretty obvious, right? Because if we're saying the biblical God exists, the descriptor is he's biblical, which implies that the biblical record is accurate. And that's what we're actually suggesting here, is that God has revealed himself. And we discover in the text that he's revealed himself in 3 ways. First is general revelation. Psalm 19, we see that the heavens are declaring the glory of God. He's revealing himself. His glory is revealed throughout that which has been made. Romans 1:18-20 tells us exactly the same thing, that he has been clearly known, clearly seen through what has been made. That these things are very evident and self-evident. So he's revealed himself in general revelation, and he's also revealed himself in special revelation. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 tells us that all these writings, as Paul is describing, these writings are God-breathed and are useful ultimately that the person of God would be adequate, equipped for every good work. So God has revealed himself in these texts, and Paul is referring to the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament text. By the time he wrote that in the mid-60s, much of the New Testament would have already existed, and those texts that didn't already exist would have been, the writings of John and Peter, for example, but they're already very much commissioned and commended already in the text. So what Paul is referring to, that all these writings are God-breathed, he's suggesting that these are from the mouth of God and are authoritative and useful and exactly what we need to do everything we're designed to do, right? So built into Paul's statement in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 is an epistemology. There's a source of authority that God has breathed these things. There's also an interpreting of that authority, how hermeneutics works, because they're useful for study and for growth so that we can be equipped. There's the provision for metaphysics that within them they tell us and describe reality, and it prepares us for ethical responsibility. So that one verse, that pericope, those verses 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 are vital in helping us understand how the biblical model is a worldview. And then God has revealed himself in personal revelation. Not meaning he's revealed himself to this person and that person and this other person, right? I don't mean that. God has revealed himself in personal revelation. According to these texts, John 1 through 18, he's revealed himself in the person of Christ. Personal, in the person of Christ. Hebrews 1:2 says something very similar, that God has spoken to us in his Son. He is the revelation of God. And in John 1, even John says he's exegeted the Father, right? Personal revelation. So God revealed himself in Christ. Christ is God in the flesh, God revealed, and Christ himself confirmed the Hebrew Scriptures, attesting to their validity, and then commissioned the various writers of the New Testament, those core writers, including the disciples, including Paul, right? Now, of course, we do have some New Testament writers that we can't really identify as apostles. For example, the author of Hebrews, we don't know who wrote Hebrews. That's really the only anonymous book in the New Testament. But Hebrews is very much kind of a commentary on Hebrew Scriptures, showing that Christ is a fulfillment and he's superior to all these elements of Revelation. So nothing earth-shattering there, not really new revelation, just helping to interpret the Old Testament revelation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So very valuable. There's nothing incongruous in Hebrews with other passages. No outlier or hapax legomena, one-time crazy saying we get some strange doctrine from. Nothing like that in Hebrews. You've got James and Jude, written by half-brothers of Jesus who are in the upper room in Acts 2, and they're a part of the program. James even referred to as one of the key elders in Jerusalem. Then you got Mark and Luke. Eusebius tells us that Mark actually wrote Peter's gospel, and that Luke was obviously a close companion to Paul and did much writing there. And so these two guys are approved and commended by those who are directly apostles. And so again, no issue there. Pardon me. So notice how all three of these things are working together. God's general revelation, special revelation, personal revelation. General revelation, God revealed himself enough so that he is known in a general sense. According to Romans 1, there's no such thing as an atheist. Everyone knows that this God exists. God revealed himself in special revelation, very specific, so we can know him very personally and intimately. But he's revealed himself in personal revelation so that we can know what is reliable special revelation. think is a good way to put it. And we can know the Father and know that he is represented well in these texts. So God has revealed himself, pillar number 2. Pillar number 3, natural man's incapacity. So the biblical God exists, he's revealed himself, and then we have a problem. There's this capacity problem. John 1 describes the darkness, right? That he shines into the darkness, and the darkness can receive him. Romans 1:18-20 describes how we reject and suppress the truth and unrighteousness. 1 Corinthians 2:14 describes how, as a natural person, we can't grasp these spiritual concepts, right? And so there's a brokenness. As you look at John chapter 3, you see a very similar concept. Notice verse 18 and 19. He who believes in him is not judged. He does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed the name of the only begotten Son of God. There's already a judgment. There's a brokenness. And this is the judgment, verse 19. The light has come to the world, and men love the darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. Okay? So there's the problem. The deeds of humanity are evil, and there's a condemnation, there's a judgment. But God provides a solution, and we see that solution is in the revelation of Christ. He has revealed the Father, drawn all to the Father, and the Father interacts with, has mercy on those on whom he'll have mercy. Now, John Calvin kind of went an interesting direction there, because he also asserted the inverse, that if God chose some on whom to have mercy, then he also chose those who would not be receiving mercy. He chose them not to have mercy. Okay, I can't say that. So I would suggest Romans 9 is talking about what God did. It is not asserting, it's not making assertions about what God did not do, if that makes sense. So I think you have to be careful with that, but Calvin's not necessarily wrong, but it's exegetically not the best jump to make from Romans 9. So that's worth some thought and consideration when you're kind of looking at God's overall predestination and foreknowledge and all these concepts, which you see again in Ephesians 1:4-7, that God has intervened. That's kind of the punchline. God has intervened to overcome whatever that incapacity is. So the biblical God exists. He's revealed himself in these 3 ways, and he's revealed himself in such a way as to be understood, and in such a way that we can respond positively. And he has interceded in order to overcome those particular problems that humanity has. Okay? Now the 4th pillar is the need for a consistently applied hermeneutic. Now, that seems kind of like an interesting jump. Why would we go there? We've got our source of authority. Biblical God exists. We understand where to look to find what he said. That's God's word, right? He's revealed himself. These 3 types of revelation point us to his word. Okay? There's an incapacity for us to engage with God, to relate to him on a personal level, but he's offset that and provided means of interaction, particularly by grace through faith, that we might become these new creatures in Christ. So we get the source of authority. Now we can connect with the source of authority. How do we interpret that authority? Okay. Well, I would just suggest that we need to consistently apply a hermeneutic model. Why? Why consistency? Why put this rule on our hermeneutic method? 2 primary reasons. You could add more, but one is basic authority. The author has authority to communicate what the author desires. Capital A, author. Postmodernism, as has been said, is essentially the idea. Leo Apostel describes this in one of the articles that you're assigned. I think in his interview, he says that postmodernism is essentially the idea that true communication is impossible. Okay? Well, the nature of communication and authority of the author demands there's communication and understanding, and the author determines meaning, right? If there's not a consistent method, then the author has no authority over the meaning, because we can mix methods. Secondly, the issue is consistency is necessitated by language as a vehicle. Did God determine, pardon me, did God determine that language was a suitable vehicle for him to communicate himself and his truth? Simple answer biblically is absolutely. If language is a suitable vehicle, then it is designed to be understood. It can be understood, and we follow the basic simple rules so that it is understood. And those rules require, or constitute, I should say, a hermeneutic that we would consistently apply. There are other principles we could throw in there, but just to introduce the concept, we need a consistently applied hermeneutic in order to make this work. So just think through these various methods, okay? And this isn't a comprehensive list by any stretch, but as you think about the source of authority being God revealed in Scripture, which hermeneutic method best accommodates his authority and the author's authority and the concept of language itself? Well, we've got a number of different methods. Spiritualization looks beyond the literal meaning to a deeper meaning. Who determines that deeper meaning, though? Is it even possible to have a consistent application there? What I consider a deeper meaning and what you consider a deeper meaning might be two different things. And so it's impossible for us to consistently apply the spiritualization hermeneutic consistently throughout the whole of Scripture. How about allegorical hermeneutics? Again, it does the same thing as spiritualization. It's just looking for it's a different motive. Spiritualization is trying to find deeper meaning, be more spiritual. Allegorical is trying to fix problems in the text. Things are said in a literal sense that just don't work, so therefore we allegorize them. And in an allegorization, we fix the problem, because it's not, you don't take that literally, of course, you take it figuratively, problem solved. But who's to determine what's allegorical and what's not? Who's to determine the allegorical meaning? Again, you can't consistently apply that method. How about the theological method? This is imbuing the text with our theology. Putting our theology into the text, we all have different opinions, we all have different beliefs, different theologies, and these different ideas, we're inconsistent for sure. And what text requires me imbuing theology versus another text not requiring that? Can't be consistent there. Canonical, complementary, suggesting that the New Testament complements or redefines the Old Testament. But how do I determine which passages are redefining old ones? Who gets to make those judgment calls? And am I really saying that the people who had the Hebrew Scriptures, which Paul says are God-breathed and useful, that they had the wrong understanding all that time until the New Testament passages came along? No, of course not. That's highly problematic and certainly can't be applied consistently. How about a canonical approach, where in a canonical approach, essentially the church, capital C, is telling us how we should interpret the text. I suppose in a sense you can be consistent there, but who's now the source of authority? The Bible is no longer the source of authority. Now the church, capital C, is. So we can be consistent in our hermeneutic, but the source of authority changes. If we have God as revealed in Scripture as a source of authority, then the canonical model does not work consistently. Trajectory. We have, here's an illustration. We have slavery okayed in the Old Testament, regulated in the New Testament. By the time we get to 2,000 years later, we know slavery is bad. We don't need God's ethics and God's divine guidance in our own ethical understanding, because we understand we've evolved. Just put it that way. So the trajectory hermeneutic takes us outside the realm of Scripture. We are arriving at our own understandings that are now more mature. Well, again, that changes the source of authority from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Greek Scriptures, to now me and you. Again, change the source of authority, can't consistently apply that hermeneutic. Genre override. Genesis 1 through 11 is this Near East myth. Isaiah is written by 3 different guys. Part of it's historical, part of it's not. Daniel and Revelation are apocalyptic. Mark through John are Greco-Roman bios. What do we take at face value versus what do we not? Genre override arbitrarily asserts a genre type on a kind of literature in Scripture so that you don't have to apply a literal hermeneutic. Genesis 1 through 11 is myth. Based on what? It's claiming to be historical fact. Matthew through John are Greco-Roman bios. Based on what? They're claiming they're writing to be fact. And they're claiming that these events happened. Luke, so you may know the exact truth of what happened. Genre override doesn't work. It certainly doesn't respect authority of the author, capital A. It doesn't respect the normality of communication and language, and it cannot apply this any hermeneutic consistently because you're arbitrarily overriding the text with a genre label. Okay? There are others, but these are just a few. Then there's the literal grammatical historical, which would be literal in the sense it's taken at face value, in the normative way that communication would be understood. Grammatical in the sense that it is respecting the rules of the grammar of the language in which the text was written initially, and historical, respecting and understanding the culture and context of the time in which it was written, recognizing that the language was in a particular time period, right? So literal grammatical historical. Another way to say that would be normative, and I know people will bristle at that because diversity is such a great thing. We marvel at God's the diversity He's provided, and so in certain contexts, the idea of normality or normal is not ideal. But in others, where God has revealed it, I would suggest it's vital. There are certain standards for normal, certain concepts, and we see that in hermeneutics. For example, in Genesis, we've got roughly 100 speech acts of God. I want to say 79 of those, we have the responses recorded in the text, and in all of them, where the response to what God said is in the text, it's always the response reflects a literal grammatical historical interpretation. That's roughly 2,000 years of history. That is a precedent that it'd be foolish to just set that aside. You need some exegetical data to set it aside. So the literal grammatical historical accommodates the authority of the capital A author, accommodates the validity of language as a communicative vessel, and it's the only one that we can apply consistently. Now, do we do it? I'm not going to argue we do. Of course, we bring our own baggage to the table, and we've got to deal with that. But we should be attempting to utilize the literal grammatical historical method. If we're doing that, we look at our epistemology. Our source of authority is God is revealed through Scripture, and we can recognize, we interpret what he said by the normative Little Grammatical Historical Method that's modeled in Genesis. Okay? Now we can arrive at certainty and truth, and we can move into an ontology, understanding what exists from what has been shared with us in Scripture and our observation, right? He gave us these eyes, he gave us our ability to sense, he gave us our use of reason. So we're using all of these tools, but we're recognizing that he's authoritative and my tools are not. So I can engage in ontology and study that which exists, recognizing the description provided by Scripture. I can get into axiology and study value and understand what is good and what is conversely bad based on what has been revealed. I can understand the purpose, the meaning, the teleology, the design based on what's revealed. I can understand eschatology, where it's all going. So I have this very thoroughgoing metaphysic, which includes a systematic theology, and then I can move into ethics to the ought, recognizing that I have the is that justifies and undergirds the ought. Now I move forward to understanding what I should do. As an unbeliever, I need to become a believer. And as a believer, now I've got that which is God-breathed, which guides me into all the truth that I need so that I'm equipped for every good work, everything I'm designed to do, right? So that's the beauty of the biblical epistemological model. Now, let me just share a few quick implications here. How we handle the Scriptures in our hermeneutic method goes a long way in determining our socio-political understanding. For example, there's kind of three major perspectives on the law of Moses and its impact on metaphysics, ethics, and socio-political thought, right? So saying something is Christian is not really enough because that term is very broad. Even saying something is biblical can be broad if, again, we're not looking at the right hermeneutic method, the right epistemological foundation. So just look at these three models, okay? So we're talking about Moses, the law of Moses, okay, the Torah, and specifically 613 commands that were given in that covenant. And there are three views. Continuity is the first view. Continuity is saying that the law of Moses continues, right? Continuity, it continues. It divides the law into three categories: moral, civil, and ceremonial. And they're all three still in effect, okay? If the law is still in effect, it's binding on the people today. On what people? That's a good question. It's rooted in the idea that authority is law. In other words, good is being like God. God legislated from his character. His character doesn't change, therefore his legislation can't change. Real simple process. Plato has a Socratic dialogue that deals with this very concept of what makes something good and how law works. And you can't avoid these questions. If God legislated from his character, in other words, he's not legislating based on his will or his determination, he's legislating from his character, then his legislation can't change lest his character change. His character doesn't change, therefore his legislation doesn't change, therefore the law continues, and this continuity view is in effect. Well, that's held by the theonomists and the reconstructionists, who essentially are postmillennialists and amillennialists, arguing that there's no literal kingdom, but that we install the kingdom on earth and then Christ returns. But we have to shape society into a theocracy in order for that to happen. That's continuity. Well, that's a pretty big deal when you get into sociopolitical thought, right? It relies on an epistemological premise of a non-consistent hermeneutic. It creates a metaphysic in which the law continues, an ethic in which all are under the law, and a sociopolitical in which the law is to be the law of the land. semi-continuity, kind of the same epistemological premise, but a kinder, gentler version where the moral law is still in effect for sanctification. So we can't have God changing his law because he legislated from his character, so he can't change his law. But maybe we adjust it slightly where just one of the three categories is still in effect. So he's not changing the law; it's still in effect. But it's just one of these three categories. It's based on the same principle, and it's inconsistent. It's kind of a menu option. At least on the continuity side, it's very consistent. Okay. But on the semi-continuity side, it's rooted in the same concept of good as being like God. God has to do these things because it's his character. He has to. He's bound to it. He can't change his law. And then there's discontinuity. The law is not applicable for sanctification or anything else. The law is not continued. Okay? Now, obviously, all Scripture has value. It's written for our good, so we benefit from it. But the law is discontinued. It's been fulfilled. Now, this concept is found through the literal grammatical historical hermeneutic, which is that basic epistemological premise that we're talking about. And this idea is based in authority being over law. In other words, God is over law. God determines what's good. Okay. Now, when you go back to your axiology and think about what is good, you're going to have to deal with why good is good. Is good good because God says it's good, or is good good because God must say it's good because it is good? Well, if it's the latter, then you end up with a God who is subservient to the concept of good, and he must legislate what is good. So he didn't really have a choice in legislating the Mosaic Law, for example. If, on the other hand, you say God is over law, God determines what's good. Now you've got arbitrary good. Oh, no, there's no more absolute standard for good. Oh, no. Well, personally, I have no problem with this because God is good. He's the creator. He's the determiner. He determines what's good. And, for example, in Micah 6:8, he says, this is what's good for you, O man. Right? He tells us. So I don't need some universal absolute principle of good that can't vary. God is in charge of that stuff. Discontinuity is the practical application of a normative literal grammatical historical hermeneutic applied to the law of Moses and what we see later in the New Testament in Ephesians 2, for example. The law finished, served its purpose, Galatians 3, and we're not under that law. In fact, never were, by the way, unless one is Jewish, but by the time this generation was born, the law was fulfilled, so no one was under this law in this current generation, of course. So I share this just as an example, as you think through this, an example of how epistemological principles like hermeneutics really shape metaphysics, ethics, and sociopolitical thought. Totally shapes these things. Okay, one last thing we need to cover in this module is the concept of interdisciplinarity. Okay, interdisciplinarity. Now, Newell and Green, I believe, were the ones that really coined the term back in '82, and they talk about interdisciplinary concepts and studies. And the definition they give is inquiries which critically draw upon two or more disciplines and which lead to an integration of disciplinary insights. In other words, you're taking two separate disciplines, recognizing they're connected, and you're going through the process of engaging in these two disciplines, drawing on them together, leading to an integration of disciplinary insights or conclusions. Okay, that's the basic definition, and it works for what we're talking about. The essential idea of disciplines require other disciplines. Okay. Now here's an example. This image is by E.F. Brazil. This is a hierarchy of the sciences. Now it's the hierarchy is done according to size. Interestingly enough, based on diameter in meters, and so you have the scale on the far left side, going from the smallest particle to the visible universe, right? And notice the sciences are categorized here based on the size of their scope of study, right? Chemistry and physics, for example, is focused on the atom and to a lesser degree the particle. And it works into physics, which works into the life sciences, which is focusing on the cell and cellular biology, functional biology, which leads up into physics and the social sciences. Social sciences focusing on the human being, with psychology, sociology, and physics. On then going to the next step, focusing on the solar system, Milky Way universe, with astronomy, geoscience, etc. Okay, so it's moving from small to large. So it's an interesting hierarchy, right? Here's the point. And this chart is not focused on interdisciplinarity, but it shows the interdisciplinarity. It shows how one defines the cell or the human will impact how they're engaging with a number of these disciplines. How one understands the universe will impact how they engage in physics and astronomy and even geoscience. How one perceives, for example, the age of the Earth. Now get this, how one perceives the age of the Earth will govern how they engage the study of geology, right? It's not the other way around. We do geology and arrive at the age of the Earth because it's not there, okay? There are some presuppositions that go into the study, some presumptions. Uniformitarian thought, for example, whole other conversation, but I'm just illustrating the relationship of these things. The structure of the cell impacts the makeup of a human, right? Whether a human is made up only of cells or whether there's more than that would drive the study of psychology. Is it simply the study of the mind, or is there also the study of the soul? How does all that work? So these concepts, these studies are not individually undertaken. They are dependent on other bodies of knowledge. And in our generation, maybe in this last century, there's been such a focus on specialization, and it's been good in a sense. Specialization has allowed us to make a lot of progress quickly in a lot of different areas. Okay? But when you're looking at unifying bodies of knowledge or unifying the sciences, for example, specialization leads to a growing separateness. Incidentally, what we're trying to do in our transformative learning model, which is very much built on a biblical worldview and the concept of interdisciplinarity, where within the worldview these disciplines are interrelated and interdependent, where we're trying to, in these programs, we're trying to help you develop a strong sense of expert generalization, meaning you're skilled at problem solving and thinking across a number of disciplines to be able to still see that grand narrative, the grand truth, if you will, even as you specialize in a particular area of emphasis or expertise. The danger in specialization is never zooming out. If you're only looking at life through a microscope, then you'll find you know very little about much. Every now and then you got to zoom out, look in the telescope, right? Look at the big picture, zoom in and out. And that's what we're trying to do. That's why interdisciplinarity makes a big impact in the concept of worldview, okay? Here's another way to think about it. Epistemology, how we can know. Well, you get into logic and even some mathematical concepts. Well, that's the root of the formal sciences, right? Where does that come from? Who wrote those laws? What's the basis of that? How do we know it's trustworthy? these are some things that we've got to deal with. That's epistemological stuff, right? Chemistry, physics, chemistry, cellular biology, functional biology, geoscience, astronomy, psychology, sociology. Those are all within the scope of metaphysics. If metaphysics answers the questions that those studies are asking and engaging, some of them are really resolved in the hard sciences, but the hard sciences are limited. Right? Scientific method is limited and can't answer all of those questions. So we have to deal with those limitations. We can look at interdisciplinarity this way. And here's an interesting chart from Nature.com, and this shows chords of affinity. Okay, you'll notice these bands that connect these various disciplines. Now, this is just within science, but the bands help to show the relationship between these sciences. For example, notice between engineering at, say, 10 o'clock and environment and geology at, say, 2 o'clock, right? Notice the gray band between them, showing affinity between those two at that level. The yellow band showing affinity between the material sciences and physics, right? The interesting band between the green band between life sciences and clinical medicine, right? These bands of affinity, and showing the relationship just within these various sciences, how you cannot be skilled at clinical medicine without knowing something of basic life sciences, right? Basic biology. You're not going to be able to function. So these things are very much related and interdependent. Okay. Now, what we're suggesting is that this interdisciplinarity goes further than just a couple of points of affinity within those particular sciences, but I would suggest it actually extends far beyond that, and that we're actually understanding that within worldview, all the disciplines relate and connect. Now, if we zoom out too far and we're focused on the big picture, we're not getting anything done. If we zoom in too far and we're too focused on the microscope and finding those intricate connections between all the disciplines, we're not getting anything done because we're focused on so small a problem. The balance, I think, is in moving in and out, zooming in and out, so that we can do an appropriate level of study, the microscopic level, and at the telescopic level, so that we've got the appropriate balance. Now, who determines appropriate? Well, that's axiology. That's a good question. And it's, by the way, this is a debate, and in the various articles you're reading on this, you're going to see that debate really discussed in some length. Now, related to this, you've got some reading in Plato's Book 5 of the Republic. Okay? Now, you're going to read this, and you're going to probably laugh half the time and be totally blown away the other half, but essentially, Plato is illustrating the interdisciplinarity of gender issues in worldview. He's kind of describing what an ideal society looks like, particularly how do the guardians work, and the focal point is, where do women fit in all of this? So he'll talk a little bit about where women fit. Are they equal to men? Do they do the same things as men? And there's some interesting imagery there, I'll just put it that way, that you'll get into. But we discover in Plato's writing here, he illustrates how gender issues can be a thread that you can see disciplines connecting throughout worldview. Okay? In other words, one's epistemology, how they know truth, will help determine the metaphysics. Are men and women equal? What are they designed for? Your epistemology is going to provide you the foundation to answering those questions. And for Plato, he believed in a dualistic concept similar to Nietzsche, except this idea of phenomena and noumena. Noumena is this ultimate reality. Phenomena is what we experience. For Plato, he would suggest the realm of experience, everybody engages that. That's fine. That's opinions and beliefs. But the real reality is in the forms, and you can't get there unless you're enlightened and you're like this enlightened philosopher king. So you're a philosopher. Only the philosophers can have that level of enlightenment and get to that true knowledge. And so by working through that process of gaining that knowledge, one can understand metaphysical truths and make statements about equality or lack of equality in men and women, different design, etc., which plays out in ethics. Here's what they should do about it. And then socio-political design. Well, here's how we design a society. Here's the responsibility of men and women in society. So Plato takes us in this dialogue. He takes us all the way through from epistemology to metaphysics to ethics to socio-political, showing the interdisciplinarity of worldview ideas. Okay, so it should be a useful read for you, if not a sometimes humorous one. Apostle, in his interview, recognizes the interdisciplinary problem. In other words, there's good and bad, but the big problem is when you begin to study two disciplines and you integrate the conclusions, guess what that does? That creates one new discipline, according to Apostle. And once you have one new discipline, you're now specializing in that, you're no longer interdisciplinary. So he's seeing this movement in interdisciplinarity, this movement to disciplinarity, and that undermines the whole concept. And I'm not sure he has a solution for that. I'm not so technically concerned about interdisciplinary versus disciplinarity. The point is that we recognize these disciplines need to be integrated under the roof of a biblical model or in a biblical model. They're naturally integrated. And that discipline that emerges, I would suggest, is worldview and is almost that theory of everything that allows us to place things in perspective. Imagine each discipline as a puzzle piece, and the worldview is the puzzle. Okay, you put each discipline in its place, recognizing its connection to other disciplines. Now you've got the puzzle. Okay, it's kind of putting it maybe simply. Now, in the article by Casey Jones, he's describing the advantages and disadvantages of interdisciplinary pedagogy. So it's very focused on education, which you're all in educational programs, looking at developing at a doctoral level in your transformative learning and leadership models. Well, Jones is hitting some pretty key disadvantages here. How do you do this? How do you have an educational model that emphasizes interdisciplinarity? Because number one, you no longer can use one teacher if they're a specialist. Now you need at least two who are specialists. Not only that, but they have to be able to engage with each other. This is problematic, right? It makes the process of education much more difficult. And so Jones is identifying some legitimate issues that we have to deal with when we're thinking of interdisciplinarity as an educational framework. So a few things for you to be considering and thinking about as you consider the relationship between worldview and interdisciplinarity. And I'll leave you with this closing thought here, that I think the biblical model just makes it clear and sets this beautiful system in place. In Colossians 1:15 through 17, we read these words: He, Jesus, the Christ, is the image of the invisible God. Think about that for a moment. The image, the icon of the invisible God. How can you have an image of something invisible? Think about that. But that's exactly what Paul is saying, and he knows the language well enough to know he's writing exactly what he wants to write. This Christ is the image of the invisible God. He is the physical representation of the invisible God. the firstborn of all creation. He's not the first created thing. All things are created by him. We see that in the following context. We see that in John 1 and other passages. The firstborn of all creation has the firstborn rights. The rights, the preeminent rights. That's what that term means. For by him, Jesus, all things were created. Okay, if we have a common designer and a common creator of all of these phenomena and all of the noumena, and we understand these things through common tool sets, then we can begin to see how it's possible to have a thoroughgoing, accurate worldview, and it's possible to recognize that within that, there's interdisciplinarity because of the common designer concept. By him all things were created in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So he created all things, they're created through him, and they're created for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is before all things. So he precedes all things, and in him all things actively hold together. Everything works because of him. He's very active in his creation. So this is a marvelous statement of worldview, provides us a glimpse into the meta-narrative of a creator, a designer, not one who is passive and has walked away as in deism, but one who is actively involved constantly, every second in his creation. I'll put it this way, God does not intervene in his creation according to this passage or any other passage. He doesn't intervene, he doesn't step into, he is engaged. He's the creator and the upholder of his creation. And I think that's a magnificent truth. So every discipline that we can encounter under a biblical model in the biblical worldview, every discipline is related because it fits under the designer within his design. And so any discipline is worth engaging because those disciplines will help us to uncover truth. And that truth that we uncover in one area may help inform truth in another. So worldview and interdisciplinarity, very, very connected, very interdependent, interrelated, certainly in a biblical model. I hope this has been a helpful introduction to these concepts, their relationships, and as you get started on this work, I hope you're not too thoroughly confused, but I think the reading will help guide you somewhat, and onward and upward. God bless.